Welcome to City Arts and Lectures. My name is Lara Bazelon. I'm a law professor at the University of San Francisco School of Law, and it is my honor to be in conversation tonight with Dr. Carl Hart, who is a professor of psychology at Columbia University. Dr. Hart is an award winning researcher and scientist. He's also the author of High Price and most recently his new book, Drug Use for Grownups Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, which the New York Times called powerful, and timely. Dr. Hart's research has led him to conclude that not only was the war on drugs a misbegotten and racist failure, but that it was based on a faulty premise. Basically, he believes that drugs, and when I say drugs, I mean cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, opiates, have mainly positive effects, and that he knows this not only from his research, but from his personal experience because he's used these drugs himself in the pursuit of relaxation, happiness, and also relief from living with the racism that comes with being a Black man in America. So I am very honored, Dr. Hart, to be in conversation with you. And I wanted to start by asking you a question that you ask yourself at the beginning of the book, which is why it took you so long to, in your own words, come out of the closet as a regular user of drugs. And you describe an epiphany that you had. And I was wondering if you could share that with us.
Uh, sure. You'll have to remind me of the epiphany, but one of the reasons that it's taken me so long is just I was a coward. It took me a long time to grow up. And so there were a number of sort of situations that got me to rethink what I was doing. And also just thinking about the people who were identified as drug users and how they are persecuted and vilified for doing exactly the same thing that I and millions of other Americans do. And so to sit by idly while these people took the heat, it seemed wrong. And so that's one of the reasons that I came out. But it took me a long time to realize my responsibility to get over the fear of what this means, how people would judge me. So there's a lot going on, was going on, and currently going on. I'm sure we'll talk about that tonight.
So, to push you a little bit further about this, in the book, you describe this experience where you're in Portugal in 2016 at the
Oh,
Boom Festival, and you had just taken this 2CB pill. And that's when this kind of realization
yeah.
washes over you. And what's so fascinating to me about that story is so often when people tell you that they have realizations when they're under the influence, they'll often dismiss it as being some kind of drug induced silly idea. But in fact, this was the idea that's the germ for the book. And I think in some ways it kind of undergirds your entire premise about drug use.
No, you're absolutely right. You're talking about the after the Boom Festival, I was in a Lisbon hotel and had taken 2CB and had just come back from dinner, and I was listening to Nina Simone sing Why, and she was talking about in the song Martin Luther King's assassination, his death. And that song really got me to think about what it meant to stand up for what you believe in, what it meant, what liberty meant, and were we as Americans going to stand up for our noble ideas, our beliefs, like this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, meaning that we could all live as we see fit, as long as we didn't bother anyone else. And so listening to that song over and over and the sort of mournfulness and the soul in which she sang it, one, it's hard for someone who's conscious to be unmoved. And of course, I was moved. It moved me so much to write about it, as you nicely put.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you felt this need to sort of stand up for people who, as you say, were being targeted because of their drug use and because of the way that our society in particular criminalizes drug use. And you write about how race is inextricably intertwined with this war on drugs that has been going on now for decades. And you say, this isn't a war on drugs, this is a war on us. And when I read that sentence, I was very powerfully moved by it, in part because as a federal public defender formerly, I represented so many clients who were Black and brown who were caught up in the system. And it was very, very clear that they had been specifically targeted. So you do not need to convince me, but you do need to convince a vast swath of people, including, as you say, these politicians and law enforcement officers who often run and win on tough on crime platforms and really use these prosecutions as a reason to ask for more money, bloat their budgets, build more prisons and jails. And so I guess my question to you is, how do you do that? How do you de-arm the generals in this war?
Um, that's a great question. One of my strategies is to go to the people directly. That's why I wrote a book that I hope is digestible and easy to read for people who are of just the general audience, that who are not neuroscientists, who are not psychologists. The thing that I try to help people to understand, and this is the thing that people just simply don't know, they think that drugs like cocaine and heroin are banned because of their pharmacological effects, because of how dangerous these drugs are. That's just not true. When you go back in history, the late 1800s, early 1900s, you'll see that cocaine was used by a number of Americans, many Americans. Coca-Cola, that product was started with cocaine in it, and it was banned. Cocaine, that is, was banned because Black people had access to cocaine, because people did not want Black folks to have access to cocaine. And they were also, we already had this racial hostility aimed at racial minorities with the Chinese in San Francisco. In San Francisco, they were upset with the Chinese. And so the local ordinance banned opium dens, or they regulated opium dens in a way that would put the Chinese merchant out of business. Eventually, this all culminated to the level of us banning opioid-based drugs and cocaine at the federal level in 1914, because not because of the drugs pharmacological effects, but because of the groups that were said to be using these drugs, the groups that were vilified as a result of their use of these drugs. That's why these drugs were banned. These drugs were banned because of good old American racism, and that continues to this day.
And I guess something else that really struck me too is that it seems like there's this vicious cycle where systemic racism can cause people of color to use drugs to help soothe the agony of living with that. And then the drugs are criminalized and the people of color who use them are targeted. And then that furthers systemic racism. I don't know if you think about that cycle at all. And I want to get back to you about that specifically personal to you on a different question. But my question to you is, do you think that you would use drugs less if the world were less racist?
So I want to be clear. I started out writing this book as a joyous book, and not as like drugs to solve or cure some pathological effect like anxiety or something. That's not it. A number of Americans, for example, use alcohol as a social lubricant. And then other Americans use alcohol to relieve anxiety. The point is that drugs are used for a variety of reasons, and many of us, most, use them to have a good time, to increase their the joy in terms of social interaction. So one of the things that we're comfortable with in this society is saying that, okay, you can use the drug medically, and then we'll put these other police in control of your use of that drug. Those police are called physicians. And again, if you have these gatekeepers can discriminate. They can determine who has access. And so I am not for having these drugs be used or only available in that medical setting. Now, we can think about activities that we do in order to relieve stress, anxiety. Me, I love comedy. I love live comedy. I go to see live comedy for that reason. But we wouldn't think of that as being something that I need a physician's prescription to go see a comedy show. Whereas if you want to like maybe use a drug for that purpose, then people start to think about it in pathological terms. So I want to make sure the audience understand that I am not talking about drugs in terms of their medicinal use. That's not, this is you as an adult making the decision that this drug will enhance your functioning, and you make that choice. It enhance your functioning, whether it's social functioning or whatever you like. That's what I'm mainly talking about in this book.
But let me press you on that point because you talk about doctors as kind of in the police enforcement role, but you also are very, very specific about saying what my theory is about regular drug use is limited to one, grown-ups, two, people who are
Yes.
physically and psychologically healthy, and then three, you talk a great deal about dosage and setting. And so with respect to that latter point, don't you need the doctors? Don't you need the experts? Otherwise, isn't it going to go off the rails?
Well, that's like saying, don't we need physicians to tell us how to use alcohol? We don't. We have all of this massive public education about the appropriate times to use alcohol, how to do it in our movies and so forth. So no, I don't think we need physicians to tell us to how to use heroin, for example. We certainly need the federal government to ensure quality control, and also to ensure that the amount that's contained in a unit dose, like in a bottle of alcohol, we put enough in there not to kill you, but enough for you to have the effects that you're seeking. But we certainly can put enough alcohol in a bottle to kill you, but we don't do that. You can do the same sort of thing with heroin, and that helps to provide some safety nets, some safeguards. I am talking about adults, and it would be irresponsible for me not to make sure that people understand that if you're going to engage in drug using behavior, as well as driving a car, any behavior that is potentially dangerous and also could be potentially fatal, you must be a grown up, because you don't put yourself at risk, not only yourself at risk, but you're putting you could potentially put other people at risk. And so growing up is work, it's difficult, it's an ongoing process. And I just wanted the reader to understand that with this freedom that I'm advocating for, this liberty, comes with it responsibility. And I talk a great deal about this sort of responsibility that is required. And so I try and target the book towards grown-ups. And when we talk about how do you get this knowledge about set and setting,
Mm-hmm.
please read the book. There is loads of knowledge. There is dope science in the book for you. If they read the book, they'll get virtually everything they need to know in the book about how you do these things in a way that enhance your happiness, safety, joy, your interactions with others.
So, is the logical extension of the argument that drugs should be legalized? Because if they were to be legalized, first of all, you would cut out the whole system of prosecution that you and I have been talking about. But second of all, they would be regulated in the way that alcohol is. I mean, you referred to there's not enough alcohol in a bottle to kill you, assuming that you drink an appropriate amount. So, is it the same argument with drugs, which is to say, if they were legalized, then they would be packaged and sold in a way that was not contaminated and also telling the person how much they should take?
Absolutely. Every day we see something about the overdose crises, the opioid crises. And one of the main reasons people are dying is because they're getting contaminated drug. They don't know what's in their street drugs. And if we legally regulate the market, one of the things that we do is increase the quality control. And so that's an argument that I'm making in the book. Another argument is that we will take away this tool from law enforcement to selectively go after people who are poor, people who are in minority communities. That's how the war on drugs is being fought, primarily on the backs of people who are poor and people who are disaffected, minority folks. So that's another sort of benefit if you care about your fellow citizen. That's another benefit. You get rid of some of that those arrests that are related to the war on drugs.
I want to go back in time to the former Dr. Carl Hart, and that Dr. Carl Hart subscribed to a theory that you should not use drugs. I mean, I think that was part of not just your upbringing, but also your academic training. And I'm curious if you could just talk about the evolution of your thinking in the sense that your whole job was to research addiction and patterns of addiction and how people responded to drugs with the premise that drugs were bad, but you've come to the
Yeah.
opposite conclusion. And I find that really fascinating. So, can you explain how that came about?
Yeah, like you point out, I've been studying drugs for about 30 years, and I got into the sort of study of drugs. My One of the main reasons was because I thought I was going to solve this issue of drug addiction. The problem, I thought that the problems that afflicted my community were directly caused by drug use, drug addiction, and so I thought if I could solve drug addiction, then I could solve the problems that I saw in my community. Unemployment, rates of violence, and a number of these sort of things, poor education. And so I thought curing drug addiction, you could do that. Then over the years, what I learned was that, hold up, the problems were there long before any drug that we are talking about, whether it's crack cocaine, whether it's heroin, whatever the drug is that we're talking about, the problems were there. And another thing that what I saw was that drugs were far more prevalent in white communities that were thriving. And so we couldn't say that it was a result of drugs themselves. And then another piece of evidence was that my job paid me to give the drugs that we have vilified, to give those drugs to research participants. I gave crack cocaine to research participants. I studied their effects on these folks' brains, behavior, social interactions, their sleep. And during my study of these drugs, the predominant effects were positive. People were having a good time. People enjoyed themselves. And not only that, those folks who we said were irresponsible, whatever we said about them, they showed up on time. They handled their responsibilities. We put demands on them. They met these demands. All of this evidence was inconsistent with my view of drugs. And when the evidence start to conflict with your behavior is, your thinking is, then it's incumbent upon you as a thoughtful, flexible thinker to change your mind, so such that it is consistent with the evidence. And that's all I did.
You study addiction, and you also write that this book is not about addiction, and you've been very clear about the purpose of the book and why you wrote it. But addiction is still, as you know, an unavoidable topic when you write about drug use. And I'm going to give it to you that addicts are in the minority of drug users, but there's still millions of them. And we know that people who are addicted can lose their jobs, their relationships can fail, they can get involved in the criminal justice system to feed their addiction, their health can be severely impacted. I feel like every time I read a headline, a celebrity has died of an overdose. So I'm accepting your argument too that many of these deaths could involve multiple substances, contamination, excessive doses, but it still doesn't erase the problem. So I guess my question to you is, short of legalizing drugs, and we seem to be far short of it, how can people use now illegal drugs without becoming addicts? And for some people, including healthy, high functioning adults, is that simply not possible because they have an addictive personality?
Okay, great question. But the question supposes that drugs are the cause of addiction, and that's a flawed sort of flawed question. And if that's the premise, now, let's think about this. The majority of people who meet criteria for this thing we're calling drug addiction, they have co-occurring psychiatric illnesses, something like anxiety disorders, depression, others, anxiety. Some people have pain issues where they're in a great deal of pain. Other folks have issues such that oh, let's say they are from Ohio or Michigan or one of these Rust Belt states where they once made a middle class living and they were somebody in their community. They had a role. GM or whatever company it is moved to Mexico and moved somewhere else for cheaper labor. That job is gone. That person is nobody anymore in that community. Now you have problems at home, all kinds of things. And drug addiction is just one of the sort of expressions of those problems. And we would be mistaken if we blame drugs for that problem and not GM for that problem. And that's what we do. There are other sort of causes or reasons. Some people just have not emotionally developed. They haven't developed the responsibility skills. And sometimes young people have problems with that. This is a normal developmental trajectory. And so, but the problem is not drugs. It would be like saying every year in the United States, we lose 40,000 Americans to car accidents every year. I mean, when you add that up, that's millions of people, but nobody is talking about banning cars. Instead, what we do is we say, how do we enhance the safety of this activity? We implemented seat belts, speed limits. We make sure people they meet certain requirements before they get behind the wheel. They have to be a certain age. We do all of these things to make the activity safer, or as safe as we possibly can make it. Whereas with drugs, we just ban them. And that's what I'm saying. That's an inappropriate response. That's an adolescent response. And we've been allowed to behave like adolescents when it comes to drugs. And we blame drugs for everything the society does not want to deal with. And that situation is a wet dream for politicians. But for the rest of us, we're suffering as a result.
So I'm going to ask you a question that's almost moving in a different direction. And I kind of can't believe I'm asking, but is there an argument that using drugs in the way that you describe, in other words, in a regulated setting at an appropriate dose, could, for example, make someone a better parent, not a worse one? So let me just give you a hypothetical.
Yeah.
The pandemic has meant that many people, and primarily the research shows mothers, have had to exit the workforce or have had to severely curtail their jobs or do them at home, and at the same time have to take care of small children. And we're talking 2, 4, 6 years old, sometimes a little older. And the stress and the pressure, and also just the boredom and the unrelenting hour after hour and these endlessly stretching days. Do you think that parenting could improve if some parents took drugs? Would that be a helpful thing?
Well, yeah, but I don't think you need me to answer that. You can ask the millions of Americans who are already doing this. I mean, people come home and they have whether it's a cocktail, whether it's marijuana, whether it's something else, whether somebody uses MDMA with their partners to regroup. Of course, Americans already know this. It's just that we are not being honest about this. And what ask the writer, ask anyone who is productive without a stimulant. Would you be as good? Would ask some in the 1950s, 1960s, the amphetamines were the mother's little helper. It was also the writer's helper. It was also the drug of the president. And I don't think any of those things have changed. It's just that we don't talk about it anymore in public. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. I mean, I think we've gotten to a point now where middle and upper class people are happy to joke about how they had a couple of glasses of wine during the day to get them through a long rainy afternoon. But it's not like people are exchanging pleasantries in the grocery store and casually saying that they did some heroin while they were home with their kids. And I guess what I hear you saying is a lot of that is just this built in shame and stigma that we have around certain drugs where we kind of laugh off the use of other drugs. And I don't want to put words into your mouth, but are you basically saying that if you're being responsible about using a wide array of these drugs, that that's actually not something that people should be ashamed of?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in the questions. On the one hand, I am asking people in this book, particularly middle class, responsible, respected, privileged folks, to get out of the closet about their drug use, in part to show the country that their image of a drug user is warped, flawed, incorrect, inaccurate. And this here sort of caricaturing of the drug user is harmful. That's what, so I'm asking people to get out of the closet on the one hand. But then I'm also aware that there are a number of people who are just simply private. For example, I'm not asking you or anybody else about their sex life. That's your business. The same is true here with drug use in some respects. And so you want to respect people's privacy. I certainly want to do that. But we have to balance the lies and the harm that these lies have done to specific groups, to our society, to us, with privacy. And so it's a difficult balance. And so I'm asking people to struggle with this balance and help me change this view of drug users. And also, I want to respect your privacy just like I want you to respect mine.
I want to ask you a question that you've alluded to, which is the relationship between drug use and creativity, the relationship between drug use and productivity. So, you are, needless to say, a remarkably productive person. And I'm wondering, and I don't want to pry, obviously. And so, if you're not comfortable telling me and the many, many people listening, that's fine. But I am curious if you feel
It's
comfortable
just you and
sharing.
me. It's just you and me, Laura. We're good, right? I don't see anybody else.
I'm good. So, my question is, could you talk about or share what impact using drugs has on your ability to be creative and productive? And I guess I'm specifically asking because the whole genesis for your book was an epiphany that you had while or after you had taken the TCB pill. So, has that been a recurring thing for you?
Yeah, so I have to be careful with creativity because I want people to understand that drugs are not going to put something there that you don't have. We can think about people like Charlie Parker, their premier saxophonist, Miles Davis, the trumpeter. They both used heroin throughout a lot throughout their careers. And there were a number of people who wanted to be like Miles Davis, and they took heroin, and we don't know who they are. So the heroin it wasn't the heroin that did it. Miles put in tons of work in order to get to the level where he's at. And the same with me. All I do is work. And so it would be a mistake if someone thinks that drugs played a role in my creativity, or I don't really think that I am creative, but I know that I work hard. And if I use drugs, it's often my myopic moment, my time to chill, relax, and be in my own space. There is a myth about drugs and creativity,
Hmm.
where it puts something there that wasn't there. There are no shortcuts for doing the work. You just have to do the work. Some drugs, for example, like amphetamines, they can help you work longer and make sometimes boring, tedious tasks seem more interesting. But if you don't have it, whatever you produce on amphetamines, it probably won't be worth much. But if you have it and you've done some amphetamines and that'll be good. Maybe it's good. You are were allowed to work longer, harder, and maybe you'll produce something that you're happy with. But the work has to been have you have to have put in the work before you can think that drugs are going to put something that's not there.
Well, that leads me to something that I've been wanting to ask you this whole time. But before I get there, I what I hear you saying is obviously the talent and the work and the grit, those are the key ingredients. And there's no way that drugs can substitute or take the place of that. But what I also hear you saying is it's your time to chill and reflect. And it gives you this sort of cocoon where you can sit with your thoughts in a way that maybe you would not do as often or in the same way as if you were just completely sober all the time. And it's that reflective cocoon period that's really crucial to creativity. Would you agree with that?
I don't know if it's creativity. Like if I want to reflect and chill, for example, I oftentimes think a lot about how my behavior has affected other people. Uh, for example, my interactions with subordinates. Did my interactions cause them stress, anxiety, cause them a problem such that it impacts their loved ones? I have to think about those things. And sometimes in the spaces where I use a substance where I'm just chilling and thinking about it, it helps me to be more conscientious of my interactions with others the next time. That's a good thing. Sometimes some drugs can help me get to that place better than others, in part because I'm always thinking about the next project. I'm always thinking about um, uh, uh, the perils of being a Black man in America. I'm always thinking about those things and how to make this world a better place for my children, for other people. How do you do that? So my mind is always racing with those kinds of things. And sometimes drugs can help me kind of calm that and think about something else that needs to be attended to, like uh, my children, my wife, or what have you.
You tell some very moving stories in this book, and one of them goes to the last point that you made about being in the world as a Black man and also as the father of Black sons. And you tell this story, and it happened in 2019 with your son Malachi in his school. He's an athlete, a student athlete, and he had come back with some friends after a game, and they had gone into the athletic part of the school, I guess, to change their clothes, and they were basically escorted out by security, told they could not be there. And even before that happened, it was very clear that the security didn't actually believe that they were students who belonged there and were suspicious of them, essentially because of the color of their skin. And as a result, your son was basically booted off of his own campus in the dark before you could go and get him. And at the same time, your beloved family dog was dying. And so you had to deal with the death of the dog. You had to take the dog to the vet and watch this really awful, sad process of the dog passing away. And then you had to go collect your son from this really horrible event. And I should also say that the year before, a student at his school had called him the N word in a video. And so all of this is just sort of piling up. And you talk about the enormous amount of pain and anguish and stress and grief that you were feeling and rage, and how you needed to really take some time and step away from that and go into this different place and be with your wife and use drugs to really figure out how you were going to parent your son through this horrible process, including what had happened to him at school, the dog, and just these lifelong lessons of being a Black man in America.
Yeah, I don't. This is still pretty raw. This situation, and it's a hard thing to really talk about. But people who will get the book, they can read about this story. I'll just cut through the chase and just talk about how Yeah, so we take time to use something like MDMA or 6-APB, read about it, and those sort of compounds help me and her, my wife, to reflect, think about how to handle these situations, and also to be loving and empathetic, and how to be better people in the face of situations where other people are not treating you as human as they would have you treat them. And so, how do you do these things when you know there's a problem, and but you don't want to engage in the same behavior that the perpetrators, those people, are engaging in? How do you do it? And sometimes something like MDMA or 6-APB can really enhance your ability to handle these situations firmly but lovingly. And so I described this in a chapter. Like I said, it's very raw because um, it's my belief that if more Americans would have access to that sort of those emotions, those feelings, we would have a better country. We would really care more about our fellow citizens and not this lip service nonsense that we oftentimes give to what kind of people we say we are. We are caring, forgiving. We are not. And I mean, it's evident by the fact that we don't even have basic health care for our citizens. And so, like I said, if people had access to those emotions, those feelings, they would work on being better people, and it would be less taxing to be in America in my skin.
When you talk about grace and empathy, obviously as a parent, you summon that for your son and for your wife because you love them and they're your family. I think the much harder thing to do is to summon grace and empathy for the people who are harming them. And part of what to me was very frustrating about this story was that after this incident at the school's response was to say, okay, Malachi and Dr. Hart, well, why don't you come in and help us figure out a plan to make our security system less racist? And if I heard that, I would lose my mind. And so I'm wondering if part of this whole process that you're describing is just getting to the point where you can respond with grace and empathy, and how it is possible to get there when it's so much easier to just get angry.
Well, let's be clear. I'm a screamer. I got angry, and so I get angry. But I also have a job as a parent, and so my job as a parent is to model for Malachi how you handle these situations, because they will happen to you again, or someone else that you love, and you will have to know how to handle it later in life. And so that's my job, for first and foremost, as a parent. And so we went about showing him how to handle it, how you go about it, how you take all of the appropriate steps, you exhaust all of the avenues available to you, and in that way, it increases the likelihood of you not being dismissed. And we felt like we did our job there, and we feel like he's a great kid. He knows how to do this. I couldn't be prouder. In part because of how we modeled this, and to be clear, 6-APB or MDMA was helpful, extremely helpful, beneficial in this setting, in this sort of way, in order to help me to get to the place where I got over my initial impulse to burn down the school, for example. Instead, I handled it in a much more constructive manner.
I want to ask you how your book has been received among your colleagues. I mean, before the pandemic struck, you traveled the world because you have expertise in drug use and addiction, and you're constantly at conferences talking to other people who are at this very high top tier level where you are. And I'm wondering, obviously, you're not traveling, but you must certainly be interacting and exchanging ideas. And I don't know if you can generalize, but what has the response been? Because you do say a lot of controversial things.
um, uh, that's funny. I don't know how it's been with all of my colleagues. So the ones who reach out it's a positive response, of course. And so the ones who have another perspective, they just don't reach out. So I don't know. But the general public, it's been overwhelmingly positive. People have gotten past the sensationalistic, controversial thing and moved to deal with the arguments. And that's all a writer can ask for. Deal with the arguments. And so I am exceedingly pleased. It's one of the best things that I've done, is writing this book. And it was painful. And like, as you were talking about the situation with Malachi, I can't be in public talking about this because one of the things that happened in the course of writing this book is that I can't talk about these things without crying, without welling up, without, it's like this well of tears has built up. And over the years, and I have been suppressing them, and it's a flood that's waiting to come out. And this book has kind of uh, taken the cork off of that jug of tears.
That's a really beautiful description. I'm wondering when the pandemic is over and you're able to go back to teaching the class that you were teaching in the prison, in Sing Sing prison, and interact with your students again, whether you'll be teaching this book. Do you think it's important to speak directly to people who are in some instances spending decades or even the rest of their life in prison because of drug use? And you talk very poignantly and memorably about the trips that you took to the prison and your thoughts inside and outside.
One of the conclusions that I came to after or in the course of finishing the book is that I will never step foot back into another prison. I will never teach in another prison. I came to the conclusion that I was just part of the problem. Uh, One of the things that we do, liberals, we go into these spaces and we think we're making hell better by being there. So it's like we go to hell and we bring an 8-ounce glass of water and we think that we're doing something. And when in fact, all we're doing is allowing this unjust system to continue. And so I'll spend my time trying to get rid of that system. It's too painful for me to go in to a place like Sing Sing, where we have 1,600 men, predominantly Black men, Black, healthy, strong, beautiful men, locked up behind bars. And then you go to this prison, and the first thing you see as you wait to go in, you see a big picture of Governor Cuomo and then his deputies underneath. So these 3 or 4 white guys, photos, they're the overseers, and all of these Black men. It's just too painful to be going into a place like that every week. I can't do it. It's too much for me. particularly when you interact with these guys and you see, we know why many of them are there, in large part because of American racism. And so I don't want to participate in that system anymore. I'll try and disrupt that system from the outside, but I don't want to be a part of it.
I hope you don't take offense to this, but I'm hoping that you'll reconsider only because it's going to take a long time to dismantle that system. And in the meantime, there are so many people who are locked away in there. And I think about some of my clients and the hours that it takes to see them and the areas that you have to drive through and how isolated it is, and just the thirst for humanity and someone to actually treat them like a smart human being, and the hunger for ideas and interaction. And I think that having that before you can break the system apart completely and make sure that the people who don't belong there, and that's most of them, aren't there anymore, they need food. And by food, I mean ideas and human contact to survive. And I know it's extremely painful and difficult, but because I think we're so far from what you're envisioning, I guess I'm hoping that you'll reconsider it.
I hope so too, Laura. But you know, when I went to Sing Sing every Friday night, I didn't recover for several days after being there, and it just took a toll. I mean, that was one of the most difficult things I had ever done. Not initially, because initially I was just I was going and I was helping and teaching, but when as I thought about what we were doing in this society and what's really going on, I couldn't do it. It's just too painful, particularly putting myself in those guys' position. I mean, they look like me, and uh, it took too much out of me. Maybe I got older. I'm 54 now. Maybe I could do it when I was 45, but it's too hard now for me to do it emotionally. My emotions now are on my sleeve, and I just can't do it.
Do you think that part of your emotions being more on your sleeve also has to do with the vulnerability that comes with being a parent, and realizing not just how much you've had to put up with and struggle against, but also seeing your children come of age and wanting things to be better for them and worrying that they won't?
Yeah, of course, being a parent, you understand that life isn't just about you. It's about others and others that you care about. And so, absolutely, being a parent has helped me to grow up. But it's also about like my children, they had the benefit of having me as a parent. And so they have so many skills. And I worry about them, of course, because I'm a parent. But it's those other people who are in Sing Sing who didn't have me as a parent that I really worry about too. Because what you find is that, wow, if they had this lesson, if they knew this, uh, life would be different for them. And so, that has helped me to grow, thinking about people who are not related to me, thinking about them as family, thinking about them as my fellow human. That is a place where I'm trying to go. To think about folks who I don't know, and their suffering, and thinking about their suffering like it's my own suffering.
So I'm now going to turn to some questions that we have from the audience. And I should have said at the outset to our brave listeners out there, it's not just me asking the questions. This is the part where all of you get to type questions into the chat so that I can ask them of Dr. Hart. And the first question is, how do we educate our kids about drug use?
Yeah, so when we think about our kids, although this book does not deal with that, but when we think about our kids, the drugs that adolescents, people in their early 20s, late teens are likely to use are alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. And so when we think about educating the kids, we educate them in terms of the effects that we're most concerned about with these drugs. That's one of the major things that we talk about. And so we think about alcohol. Want to help people to identify alcohol signs of alcohol poisoning. Somebody is passing out or they are comatose. What do you do? If somebody vomits when they're drinking alcohol, it's a sign that you should stop. Too much alcohol could cause respiratory depression and then cause you to stop breathing and die. But these signs are, you see these signs all along the way before you get there. Teach your children about those sorts of things. Teach your children about why people would use alcohol in the first place. It's a great social lubricant. It's not a bizarre thing that people want to use alcohol. Something like tobacco. Tobacco, if people have asthma or other respiratory concerns, you want to make sure that they know how to recognize symptoms of problems and stop when that happens. Marijuana, another one of those drugs that young people would use. What do you do? One of the most troubling effects that young people might see, particularly inexperienced young people, is that you might see this increased anxiety, paranoia, and at the smoking marijuana, particularly inexperienced users. What you want to do is just help your children understand that talk the person down, let the person know that drugs interact with a receptor, it will float away and the person will be fine. Just keep the person calm. If they get too anxious, the problems related to the anxiety or the expression of the anxiety is far more worse than the drug effect itself. So you just keep the person calm. Just basic sort of things like that will go a long way in keeping your children safe. You don't really need to talk about heroin or cocaine. Those drugs are children. They are almost not used by any children. There are a small minority who use those drugs, but frankly, if that's one of your children, if one of your children is using one of those drugs, then you got bigger problems than drugs, and don't scapegoat drugs for those other problems.
Our next listener is asking you if you can talk a little bit about how drug laws disproportionately affect communities of color. You've spoken before about how differently society has viewed and responded to the current opioid crisis versus the crack epidemic and how that relates to racism. So the listener is asking, could you please speak about that?
Yeah, so just to be clear, society has responded to the opioid crises in the same way it responded to crack cocaine. People have this, they changed the narrative and they say we treated crack differently than we treat opioids. It's not true. Today, 80% of the people being arrested for something like heroin crimes are Black and brown people, even though they don't use those drugs more than white folks. That's the same thing that happened with crack. It's the same thing, whereas we send white folks to treatment, Black folks to jail. The same thing. That's how we deal with things in the United States. And the disproportionate sort of incarceration or arrest of poor minority folks, it's simple. We put our law enforcement in those communities. And so when you do that, your result is more arrests in those communities. And some people say, well, those communities ask for the cops. Well, those communities also ask for more jobs. Those communities also ask for better education, better housing. Those communities ask for a number of things. And the only thing that they got were more cops. And so that's not a good sort of way to deal with that issue.
This listener wants to know, what are your thoughts on the way that marijuana has become increasingly legalized in American society? Do you see this as a good model for the decriminalization slash legalization of other drugs in our society?
Yeah, I am encouraged that voters have taken this issue in their own hands and decided in 15 states that they would legalize marijuana. That's consistent with the American promise, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So I am encouraged. Other states where the drug is not legal for recreational purposes are watching the legal states to see how much tax revenues those states generate. And the amount of tax revenue generated will determine what happens in those other states. But it's important to watch what happens in the South, in the southern states. The southern states have larger Black populations. None of those states have legalized marijuana for recreational purposes. And I suspect this is happening in part because probable cause, that is, I smelt marijuana and that's why the police can stop you. I think that probable cause is too important for law enforcement. That probable cause tool, if we legalize marijuana in those southern states, take away that tool from those southern police officers to harass large numbers of their Black population. That's what I speculate.
I can just add a teeny tiny 2 cents, which is
Please.
it isn't just probable cause. They only need to get to reasonable suspicion to stop and either dispel that suspicion or ratchet it up to the point of arrest. And not to get too technical, but reasonable suspicion isn't really that much suspicion at all. This question is about an assertion that you make, and you say in the book that all the evidence from the research clearly shows that most heroin users are people who use the drug and they don't have problems such as addiction, that they're conscientious and upstanding citizens. And then you say that you recognize that the statement needs some defense. So, what is the defense?
It's just that Americans have been inundated with misinformation about heroin. Think about your movies, Train Spotting. Think about the popular culture and the music. Johnny Cash is hurt. I believe Trent Reznor wrote that. It vilifies heroin and it says it gives heroin like human like qualities and it gets a grip on you and then you're addicted. It destroys your life. And so I have to defend it, that statement to people who are of that mindset. And I have to show them where that sort of position is not supported by any evidence, and it's just a sensationalistic view that works for drama and to sell products like movies and music, but that's not reality. The evidence shows that most people who use heroin are not addicted. They are like me, except they're white, but they are like me. They're responsible people who care about their society and their families.
This listener asks if you think that the response to your book has been different from the response to white writers who have written about drug use.
It's really early. The book has been out for about 2 weeks. It would be interesting. It's going to be interesting because Michael Pollan did a book called How to Change Your Mind. Michael Pollan, of course, is a older white guy. I don't know if people said that he was a drug addict or they balked at his drug use, and they certainly are balking at mine. But it remains to be seen. I don't know. Just to the questioner, thank you for the question. Please go out and support the book and let's prove them wrong. America is not racist. So please go out and buy the book.
This question asks if you think that the new presidential administration will take a different approach to drug policy.
So to be clear, Joe Biden, he was one of the architects to the current drug war. He helped write the legislation that created the drug czar office, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And so I don't think of Joe Biden as being progressive on this issue. You all know Madam Vice President Kamala Harris. Her position on marijuana has evolved. She wasn't the most progressive person on this issue, but I don't look to politicians to change this. Politicians are useless in this sort of thing. They follow the people. If the voters say this is what they want, the politicians will follow. And so I try not to waste my time on thinking about politicians.
Could you talk more about addiction not being a disease and how you've come to understand this concept so differently from how you once did?
So I didn't say addiction is not a disease, so like in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, it lists all of these mental diseases or disorders, and they have criteria that they check off, and you meet criteria, so you have this disorder or this disease. I'm not arguing that. The thing that I argue is that there is no evidence to show that addiction is a brain disease. So there's this popular notion that drug addiction is a brain disease, and the evidence just doesn't support it. When I think of a brain disease, I think of Parkinson's disease, I think of Alzheimer's disease, I think of these diseases that are, once one has it, the disease is progressive and ultimately fatal. Drug addiction is not that way. The person, if you have drug addiction, most people spontaneously recover. That it's not fatal. And with Parkinson and Alzheimer's disease, you see these neuropathological sort of structures, or whereas with drug addiction, you can't tell the brain of someone who is addicted versus someone who is not. You can't tell the difference between those brains if you are looking at those brains. And so this notion that drug addiction is a brain disease, it's just simply not supported by the evidence.
This listener wants to know if you could talk about your research process in your drug user studies.
Yeah, my original process was we were studying whatever the public had been put in a frenzy about. Like right now, a large number of studies are focused on the opioid. So you put the opioid, whatever opioid of interest it is, heroin, fentanyl, and you put it in the standard model that you had. My model was looking at whether or not humans will choose to self-administer a drug if given a choice between drug and money. You just plug in the drug du jour, the drug of the day. That was my old sort of way of looking at it. Now, as a result of having really gone around the world and gotten some real world experience with drugs, um i I now try to study the most important aspects of drug use, at least the most important aspects to me, and those are things like studying drug combinations. There are a number of people who take drugs in combination, like an amphetamine in combination with heroin, or some other drug in combination with this drug, like cocaine in combination with ketamine. I want to know about those effects, or I want to study. I would ultimately like to study drugs and sexual relationships, and that sort of thing, because that's why a lot of people take drugs, to enhance sexual performance, intimacy, and those sorts of things. We don't study that typically in the lab, and I'm interested in that these days.
This listener wants to know about the risk of tolerance for, quote, harder drugs like heroin and cocaine. Do people become tolerant to a dose quicker than, say, with alcohol or cigarettes?
Um, no, there's no evidence that someone would become more tolerant to cocaine more quickly than they would caffeine or something else. No, but the user or the person certainly can develop tolerance to all of these drugs, from alcohol to heroin. You certainly can develop tolerance, but tolerance is just a natural, a normal biological process. Tolerance is, in fact, protective. When we think about somebody who is tolerant to some of the effects of heroin, that person is less likely to experience an overdose from heroin than the person who's not tolerant. So, in that respect, heroin tolerance is protective. Tolerance usually is a good thing, but we oftentimes think of it as a negative thing.
This, I think, is the last question, and it's maybe it's a little bit inside baseball, but it has to do with what you were speaking about in terms of your research interests. And I think when you were talking about your earlier research, you were talking about it in a way that was somewhat reactive. You were reacting to the headlines about the drug du jour. And now it seems like your research is moving in a different direction. And I'm wondering if that's in part because you have tenure, and with that comes academic freedom to pursue the subjects that you're truly passionate about, rather than follow kind of a prescribed step-by-step course to get to the ultimate place that you are. And whether in some ways this book is almost like just a celebration of tenure, in the sense that you have the freedom now to write it without suffering any professional repercussions.
Yeah, tenure is important. Tenure is important for having expressing ideas that are not necessarily popular, and that's an important thing for tenure. But I want to make it clear that it has taken me a long time to grow up and develop. So that's the most important thing, developing as an adult human. When you develop and know who you are as a person, this is an ongoing process. I'm still in the middle of it. But that is the most powerful thing, because you know what you can tolerate and what you will not tolerate. One of my mentors once said to me, you got to have the ability to put the keys on the table when there is something that you can't tolerate. That means that you're willing to walk out of the door because you find this just so intolerable, and that has been the most important thing in my life. That development. So whether I was tenured or not, man, I hope I would be publicly honest. And that's the most important thing. So there are a lot of people with tenure and they are not publicly honest, not in their work and not with the public. And so I'm trying to be publicly honest.
Dr. Carl Hart, it has been such an honor and a pleasure to talk to you. And you are honest and you are brave. And this is a beautiful book. I read it twice. I'm going to read it again, and I highly recommend it. Thank you so much. And this concludes tonight's City Arts and Lectures talk with Dr. Carl Hart, who is the author of the new book, Drug Use for Grownups: Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, which has just gotten a very positive review in the New York Times. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
I loved it.